The stone floor of the courtyard at Persepolis was designed to reflect the sun like a mirror, a blinding expanse of polished limestone that screamed of divinity. But on this day, in the year 465 B.C.E., that pristine reflection was about to be shattered by a trail of crimson so dark it looked like oil. A woman was being dragged across the courtyard, her heels scraping uselessly against the cold stone, her screams swallowed by the towering walls of the most magnificent palace on earth. The soldiers gripping her arms were not fresh recruits. They were the immortals, the elite, men who had waded through rivers of Greek blood without blinking. Yet, as they hauled this woman toward her fate, their hands trembled. They kept their eyes fixed on the ground, terrified that if they looked up, they might vomit from the sheer, suffocating dread hanging in the air. This woman had not tried to assassinate the king. She had not sold state secrets. Her crime was something far more human, and therefore, in the eyes of the Persian court, far more unforgivable. She had possessed the audacity to say no. What awaited her at the center of that courtyard was a punishment so artistically cruel, so mathematically precise in its sadism, that it would silence the entire court for a generation. It was not a simple execution. Death would have been a mercy. No, this was a dismantling. A systematic erasure of identity performed with the cold intimacy of a surgeon. But here is the thing that should freeze the blood in your veins. This was not a freak accident or a singular day of madness. This was Tuesday. This was the operational standard of the Persian Empire at its zenith. We look back at the ruins of Persepolis today, at those broken columns and majestic reliefs, and we see glory. We see the movie version of King Xerxes, the gold-dipped giant, the warrior, the god. But that is the sanitized lie history sells to tourists. If the stones of Persepolis could speak, they would not sing songs of war, they would scream. They would tell you that the most dangerous war Xerxes ever fought wasn't against the Spartans at Thermopylae. It was the war he waged every single day against the humanity of the people closest to him. Behind the gold leaf and the silk curtains, the royal palace was a slaughterhouse of the soul, a place where love was a weakness, family was a threat, and the whim of one man could turn a princess into a piece of meat. You think you know the story of Xerxes? You have no idea. What you are about to hear is the story the history books tried to bury, the story of a darkness so total it consumed an entire dynasty. Welcome to the nightmare behind the crown. Welcome to medieval spirits. To understand the monster, you must first understand the cage that built him. Picture October 486 B.C.E. The throne room is a cavern of shadows and torchlight, smelling of frankincense and fear. A 36-year-old man stands alone on a dais that elevates him above every other living thing. This is Xerxes. His father, the legendary Darius, is dead, and as the crown settles on Xerxes' brow, a heavy iron door slams shut on his humanity. From this second forward, Xerxes effectively ceases to be a person. He becomes an avatar, a living idol. Imagine living the rest of your life without ever seeing another human face, looking back at you with anything other than terror. No one stands when you enter. They throw themselves face first into the dirt, performing proskynesis, kissing the dust of the floor, terrified that their breath might offend your divine air. This was not just protocol. This was psychological conditioning on a massive scale. If a messenger arrived with news that a province was burning, he didn't burst in. He stood outside the gates for days, sometimes weeks, starving and waiting, because to interrupt the king's leisure was a capital offense. Xerxes was taught that the universe revolved around his emotional state. If he was happy, the sun shone. If he was angry, empires bled. But this god complex wasn't a genetic defect. It was a survival strategy installed by his mother, Atassa. Atassa was the daughter of Cyrus the Great, a woman who had survived the bloody purges of her own family. She knew that in the Persian court, a brother was just an assassin you hadn't caught yet. She whispered the poison into Xerxes' ear from the cradle. Trust no one. Love no one. You are not one of them. You are above them. And it worked. It worked too well. Xerxes internalized this isolation until other human beings became nothing more than NPCs in his video game, existing solely to be manipulated, used, or deleted. He didn't see people, he saw props. And when a man with the power to level mountains stops seeing people as people, atrocities don't just become possible, they become inevitable. But even a god king has desires, and even a palace of gold can feel like a prison when the only voice you ever hear is the echo of your own commands. As Xerxes grew older, the isolation began to rot him from the inside out. He needed to feel something, anything, to prove he was still alive, and that need for sensation would lead him to commit a violation so profound it would tear his own family apart. Let us walk into the Anderun, the royal harem. Erase the Hollywood fantasy from your mind right now. This was not a hedonistic playground of scantily clad women feeding each other grapes. This was a fortress within a fortress, a high-security political institution guarded by eunuchs men who had been castrated to ensure their absolute loyalty and inability to touch what belonged to the king. The Anderun was silence. It was the rustle of heavy silk, the smell of rose water masking, the scent of stagnation. The most powerful women in the world lived here. The king's mother, his wife, his daughters. They had wealth that could buy nations, robes woven with gold thread, and food flown in from the edges of the map. But they were inmates. They could look out of the high, latticed windows at the dusty sprawl of Persepolis below, hearing the distant hum of the market, the laughter of commoners, the sounds of life. But they could never join it. They were preserved like rare butterflies pinned under glass, beautiful and dead. Yet, within this suffocating silence, a hierarchy existed that was sharper than any knife. At the top sat Queen Amestris. She was Xerxes' only wife, a woman of terrifying intellect and cold ambition. She wasn't just a spouse, she was a partner in power, commanding her own estates and private armies. She knew the rules of the game better than Xerxes did. She knew that in the Anderun, your only value was your proximity to the king, and she guarded that proximity with the ferocity of a tigress. But even Amestris, with all her power, served at the pleasure of the king. One wrong word, one faded look, and she could be replaced. This created a pressure cooker of paranoia. Every woman in the Anderun was watching every other woman, waiting for a slip, a sign of weakness. It was a snake pit where the vipers smiled and called each other sister. And into this volatile, high-stakes environment, Xerxes was about to drop a match. He was bored, he was restless, and his wandering eye landed on the one woman in the empire who was strictly, absolutely off limits. The silence of the Anderun was about to be broken by a scream. The year is roughly 478 B.C.E. Xerxes has returned from Greece, his ego bruised, his grand invasion a failure. He retreats to Persepolis to lick his wounds, and like many narcissists facing defeat, he seeks a conquest he can control. He sets his sights on the wife of his brother, Mesistis. History, in its typical misogyny, hasn't bothered to record her name, but we know who she was. She was the wife of the greatest general in Persia, a woman of unimpeachable virtue. Xerxes, the god king, assumes this will be easy. He is the sun. Surely she will want to bask in his light. He approaches her. He offers her jewels, status, the world. He leans in, expecting submission, and she says no. Pause. Let the weight of that sink in. A woman, standing before a man who can order her beheaded with a wave of his hand, looks him in the eye and refuses him. It wasn't just a rejection, it was a heresy. She was telling the God King that he was not irresistible. She was asserting that she was a person with a will of her own, not a thing to be used. For a moment, the universe must have seemed to stop for Xerxes. The script he had been following his entire life had just been rewritten. For most tyrants, this would be the moment the guards are called, but Xerxes was psychologically complex. The refusal didn't just anger him, it obsessed him. It made her real in a way no one else was. But instead of respecting her boundary, his twisted mind found a loophole. If he couldn't have the mother, he would take the next best thing. He turned his gaze to her daughter, Artente. She was young, perhaps barely 20, the niece of the king. She didn't have her mother's steel, or perhaps she simply didn't understand the danger she was in until it was too late. Xerxes seduced her, and in the arms of his niece, the king found a sick kind of victory. He had bypassed the mother's refusal by corrupting her own flesh and blood. It was a power move, a way to assert dominance over the entire family line. But Xerxes wasn't done. He wanted to twist the knife. He wanted to prove that his power was absolute, that he could take anything from anyone at any time. And that desire to show off would lead him to make the stupidest mistake of his life. The affair with Artente was torrid and reckless. In a moment of post-coital arrogance, Xerxes, feeling like the generous god he believed himself to be, made a promise. "Ask of me what you will," he told the girl, "and it shall be yours." It was the classic blunder of fairy tales and nightmares. Artente, perhaps emboldened by her new status as the king's favorite, or perhaps guided by a darker fate, didn't ask for gold or cities. Her eyes went to the robe draped over the chair. It was a masterpiece of weaving, a kaleidoscope of gold and royal purple, a garment that shimmered like a living thing. "I want that," she said. Xerxes froze. That wasn't just a robe. It was a labor of love, hand-woven by Queen Amestris herself. It was the ultimate symbol of the queen's favor, a tangible representation of her marriage to the king. To give it to a mistress, and not just any mistress, but his niece, was an insult so profound it was practically a declaration of war. Xerxes tried to talk her out of it. He offered her mountains of gold, entire armies, palaces, but Artente, with the petulance of youth and the intoxication of power, dug her heels in. "You promised?" she said. "Are you a king who keeps his word? Or are you a liar?" Trapped by his own divine boast, Xerxes handed over the robe. Imagine the scene. The heavy silk sliding from the king's hands into the girl's grasping fingers. It wasn't just cloth. It was a death warrant. Artente didn't hide it. She wore it. She paraded through the palace, the queen's gold thread catching the light, a walking billboard of the king's infidelity. When word reached Queen Amestris, she didn't scream. She didn't weep. She went very, very still. She knew exactly what this meant, but Amestris was a predator who played the long game. She didn't blame the foolish girl. In her mind, the girl was just a pawn. The real enemy, the root of this rot, was the mother, the woman whose initial rejection had started this entire domino effect. Amestris decided that payment was due, and she would collect it in blood. The trap was set for the king's birthday. This was the most sacred day in the Persian calendar, the Tikta, a feast where the king was bound by unshakable custom to grant any request made to him. The banquet hall was a sea of excess mountains of roasted meats, rivers of wine, the air thick with laughter and music. Xerxes sat on his throne, drunk on power and wine, wearing the smile of a man who thinks he has gotten away with everything. Amestris sat beside him, the picture of the dutiful wife. She waited. She waited until the laughter was loudest, until the eyes of every noble, general, and satrap were fixed on the dais. Then she leaned over and whispered her request. "Give me the wife of Mesistes." The room didn't hear it, but Xerxes did. The color drained from his face. He knew. He instantly knew. He looked at his wife and saw the abyss staring back. "Ask for anything else," he hissed. "Ask for a city? Ask for a treasury?" But Amestris just smiled, that thin, cold smile. "The law is the law, my king. You cannot refuse." Xerxes was checkmated. To refuse in front of his court would be to admit he was weak, that he was a rule breaker, that he was not a god. His vanity outweighed his morality. With a nod that felt like a gavel striking a coffin, he signaled the guards. The soldiers marched out. The music played on. But the party was over. What happened in the queen's chambers is the stuff of nightmares. When Mecystes' wife was dragged in, she wasn't killed. Amestris wanted her to live. She wanted her to feel. The queen's eunuchs, acting on precise orders, went to work. They cut off her breasts and threw them to the dogs. They sliced off her nose, her ears, her lips, and her tongue. They turned her face, once a source of pride, into a gaping, bleeding ruin. But they left her eyes. She needed her eyes, so she could look in a mirror and see what happened when you said no to the royal family. Then, in a final act of grotesque cruelty, they sent her back to her husband's house. Not a corpse, but a message. A living, breathing, screaming message. Mecystes was waiting for his wife to return home. When the litter arrived and the curtains were pulled back, the sound that came out of that man destroyed him. The greatest general in Persia, a man who had seen the carnage of 100 battlefields, broke. He saw the woman he loved reduced to a piece of butchered meat. And in that moment, his loyalty to his brother, his king, his god, evaporated. It was replaced by a white-hot hatred that could burn down the world. Mecystes didn't just weep. He mobilized. He gathered his sons, his personal guard, and he ran. He rode for Bactria, his province, intending to raise an army and march on Persepolis to kill the monster on the throne. Xerxes saw the smoke rising. He knew that if Mecystes reached Bactria, civil war would tear the empire apart. The king couldn't allow his own brother to live, not after what had been done. He sent his fastest troops, his best killers, to hunt down his own flesh and blood. They caught Mecystes on the road. There was no trial. There was no mercy. The soldiers slaughtered everyone. Mecystes, his sons, his daughters, his servants. The entire family line was extinguished in an afternoon. The bodies were left to rot. A feast for the vultures. Back in the palace, silence returned. The problem was solved. The records would show that Mecystes was a traitor who plotted against the crown. The mutilation of his wife would be whispered about in dark corners, but never written down. Xerxes sat on his throne, the undisputed master of the world, but something had broken inside him, too. He retreated further into the shadows of his palace. He stopped campaigning. He stopped ruling. He became a ghost, haunting his own halls, looking over his shoulder, waiting for the knife he knew was coming. The system he had built on fear was eating him alive. The end came in August, 465 BCE, exactly 21 years after he took the throne. It wasn't a Greek army that killed Xerxes. It wasn't a foreign invader. It was Artabanus, the captain of his own royal guard, the man paid to take a bullet for him. In the dead of night, Artabanus and his conspirators crept into the royal bedchamber. Xerxes, the man who called himself a god, died like a frightened animal, stabbed to death in his sleep sheets stained with royal blood. But the cycle of violence didn't end with his last breath. In a final twisted act of manipulation, Artabanus tricked Xerxes' son, Artaxerxes, into believing his own brother Darius had committed the murder. Artaxerxes, fueled by lies and fear, executed his brother. Fratricide, regicide, genocide, the holy trinity of the Persian court, the walls of Persepolis, built to intimidate the world, had turned inward, becoming a pressure cooker that cooked the brains of everyone inside. The Achaemenid dynasty continued for another century, a long, slow slide into incest, murder, and madness until Alexander the Great arrived to burn it all to the ground. And maybe, just maybe, fire was the only way to cleanse that place. We look at history and see statues, we see dates, we see maps. But medieval spirits asks you to look closer. Look at the blood in the mortar. Look at the scars on the soul. The story of Xerxes isn't about a king. It's about what happens when you give a human being the power of a god, but leave them with the emotional maturity of a toddler. It is a warning that screams across 25 centuries. Absolute power doesn't just corrupt, it mutilates. It takes the human heart and carves away everything that makes it beat, until all that is left is a gaping, silent void. If you want to uncover more darkness hiding behind the golden masks of history, if you want to hear the screams the textbooks left out, hit that subscribe button. This is Medieval Spirits. Sleep well, if you can.